Hey LinkedIn, and welcome back to Business Unusual. This is a live show where we talk about the changing nature of work. I am Susie Jackson. I'm a news editor at LinkedIn, coming to you live today to talk about the pandemic's effects on older workers. Later in the show, we're going to speak with an expert in the boomer workforce about some of the unique challenges that population is facing. And before we get to that, I want to check out some of the top headlines trending on LinkedIn today. First up, the coronavirus continues to slam the travel industry. Boeing has posted a second quarter loss of $2.4 billion and announced it will slow its production of commercial jets, as well as consider additional reductions in its workforce. The airplane maker was already facing challenges pre-pandemic after two fatal crashes grounded its 737 MAX jets. Our next story comes from my colleague and fellow Business Unusual host, Caroline Fairchild. This week in her column, Working Together, she marks the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act by taking a look at how coronavirus is creating opportunities and potential pitfalls for disabled workers. One fear is that demand grows for staffing and spacing. Able-bodied workers will be brought back from layoffs and furloughs before those with disabilities, potentially creating an even bigger gap between the two groups. For more news stories like these, check out the LinkedIn News module. It's to the right of your news feed if you're on your desktop, or if you're on mobile, if you click into the search box and scroll down a bit, you will see these stories and some other great roundups from the LinkedIn News team. Also from the LinkedIn News team, we want to take a look at our daily poll today. We are asking what you think the key is to being a great mentor. Do you think a great mentor has subject matter expertise, trust and commitment, empathy and listening skills, or something else? Let us know what that is. Talk to us in the comments today throughout the show. We're going to check in on your responses at the end of the broadcast. For our main story today, we're focusing on the pandemic's effects on older workers. According to my upcoming guest, Elizabeth White, the boomer generation has already seen 3 decades of flat or falling wages, sharp rises in costs for housing, healthcare, and education, and forget about pensions. They are long gone. Now coronavirus is putting this population at an increased health risk. Some workers may not feel comfortable working or going back to work, or might not be asked back at all as companies try to do more with less. Talk to me, talk to each other on the show today. What are your thoughts on balancing your need for personal safety versus the financial need to work, maybe the emotional need to work? Have you been in this situation? Are you in this situation now? Do you know someone who is dealing with these questions? We want to hear from you as a community, how you're working through this. Help each other in the comments. Let me know what it's like for you on the ground out there. We want to get to as many of your questions, comments, thoughts, concerns as we can throughout the show today. While I welcome my guest, Elizabeth White, to the show to talk about just some of these issues. She's the author of 55 Underemployed and Faking Normal, Your Guide to a Better Life. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is a really tough time for people out here, but you've gone through some tough times yourself. I want you to start with telling us about your background and what inspired you to write your book.
So I'm someone who's done really well. And then in 2009, I was in my mid 50s at the time. I had 2 great consultancies that I was doing together, and both of them ended. And wasn't worried initially. I have a Harvard MBA. I had worked at the World Bank. I had been an entrepreneur. I had sort of all the props and credentials. I'm someone who normally I would be hearing about jobs before they were even posted. And what I found is that my phone wasn't ringing. And my network, because when you're in your mid 50s, your network tends to be sort of 10 years older and 10 years younger. So a number of people on the older side were kind of out of the game or about to retire themselves. So I wrote an essay at a point of real despair. I wasn't finding work. I wasn't getting called back. Weeks turned into months. And I wrote this essay describing what it's like to land here. What does it actually feel like? And that essay made its way to the PBS Facebook page through a Next Avenue article. And it had thousands of people responding. Me too. This is my husband, myself, my brother, my sister. And I have the background to actually look at the data. And I was stunned about how many older Americans were facing financial fragility, how many older Americans were losing jobs or had not set aside enough for retirement, and were really either looking at a work for life proposition, or I know now that some 40% of near retirees are facing poverty or near poverty conditions. So, based on that, when I looked around to read something, because no one was talking about this, the kinds of things, the people who were talking about it, like in a very academic way. They were think tanks that were focused on this. No one was talking about it as someone who had actually landed here. What do you do if this has happened to you? And so I wanted to write about that. And what happens when a story goes viral is that people will find your email address. So, in addition to all the comments that were on the PBS Facebook page, people were actually writing me directly. And when they write you directly, you get an email that's a page and a half, single space. So, I started to have all these stories. So I wrote 55 Underemployed and Faking Normal, first self-published, and then it was later picked up by Simon and Schuster, as a survival guide for older Americans who have landed here. And I wrote it, the sort of image I had in my head was I'm standing at my back fence talking to my neighbor. So I wanted it to be a really accessible book. I had a friend who said, this better not be a talkathon. You better have lots of resources in the book. So I made sure that I had a lot of resources, but I also wanted it to sort of frame the systemic part of this, because one of the things that happens is we live in a culture that if you're experiencing financial woes, we tend to blame ourselves for that. Not that there's not a personal responsibility angle, but some of these things, as I say, your bootstrap ingenuity is not going to address disappearing pensions.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to address flat and falling wages. It's not going to address, the rising cost of housing, healthcare, et cetera. So there's some things that are really outside of your control.
Yeah, and we're seeing some members in the stream facing some of these similar challenges as you're talking about. We have Dolores saying, I'm in this situation now, is laid off due to COVID-19. Teresa says, I'm in this situation too. I'm 66 years old and my job stopped due to me working in a senior home but not being deemed an essential worker. So we're seeing folks going through this very situation right now. You were talking about some 40% of retirees are actually closer to the poverty line than we all realize. It's really stark things. If you're just joining us now, I want to welcome you to Business Unusual. We're having a conversation with Elizabeth White about the boomer workforce now and the challenges to that population given the higher risks that they are under for COVID-19. I want to welcome Roberta from Florida to the show, Adrienne and her cat from Chicago. Welcome to you both. Deborah from Michigan, James from Chicago, and Gilberto joining us from Brazil. Thank you for watching. Thank you for joining our conversation with Elizabeth and I. Elizabeth, I want to come back to the COVID-19 piece of this. We're talking about older professionals who maybe aren't quite ready to retire, but they're facing increased health risks with returning to work. How should they be balancing those two very, very important things at this time in their lives?
So, I wanted to address just quickly the point that you made about the 40% who are facing near poverty conditions. And I just wanted to emphasize that we're not talking about people who were struggling all their lives and are now facing a tough time of it as they are nearing retirement. We're actually talking about middle class people who are facing this situation, who are looking at downward mobility for the first time. And I just say that to emphasize the magnitude of what we're talking about. I think to your question, one of the things we're seeing, the early reports of who the COVID-19 was impacting was mainly older adults, especially adults sort of in that 80 and up, but certainly 65 and up. But now what we're seeing is that it's really impacting everybody. Now, some of the worst COVID, the most severe symptoms are happening with older people, but everybody is impacted. So I think this question of work-life balance is now not specifically just for older adults. And some of the early things that we heard in the past about how we were almost expendable. I remember, I think it was the lieutenant governor in Texas saying that there were some things worth dying for, kind of inviting all of us who are older to maybe be willing to sacrifice ourselves. I think now, when you see Google not closing their offices, but allowing people to work from home well into next summer, that when you get companies that size looking at the safety issues around the pandemic, it's going to trickle down through the economy, so that as an older person, if this is something that you're concerned about, we're not going to be outliers anymore, having that as something that we are weighing as we consider, going back into the workforce.
Yeah, I have Linda in the stream. She is saying that she's in this situation right now, trying to build her self confidence back and hoping she'll be on solid footing once again. Esther says, I'm 67, living in Ontario. My executive position was eliminated, and I was not ready for this to happen. Coming off that feeling that Esther is sharing, you weren't ready for this to happen. I'm really curious what your thoughts are on the mindset for someone who wasn't looking for this, wasn't ready to retire, and now maybe feels forced to, or forced out, or not invited back. How do you set up for that, for the end of work in your life, if you weren't planning on it, or if you have to consider taking something that you feel like is beneath your skills and experience?
So I think the first thing is we tend to want to rush people through what they're feeling. We don't want to pause and have people, kind of honestly like feel what they're feeling, which there are things like panic even. There is, concern, there is upset, all of that is normal. So you're going to pass through that. You're going to be frustrated. I think where it's important to get to is that you don't want those feelings when you do have the opportunity to talk to a hiring manager to sort of what I call leak out of you. So in my case, what I did is I started to meet with a small group of people. They were mainly women initially, but not towards the end, who were in the same situation. Because I needed some place that I could actually vent some of this frustration that I had, so that when I did have the opportunity to talk to a potential hiring manager, or to talk to a project manager for a potential consulting job, that I was not leaking this upset and frustration. One of the things I did when I wrote the book with that in mind is I put at the end of each chapter the kinds of reflection questions that my group was discussing. And these weren't all friends of mine, because as I've done this work and traveled around the country, many people will say, I don't really have that many friends, or I don't have friends that I feel comfortable telling my business to. And I'd actually rather not, or maybe talk to people who don't know me. And so some of the people who I became very close to, I didn't know. I would reach out to them. They wrote an article that struck me in some kind of way, or they reached out to me because they saw something that I'd written, and became very much part of my network where I could go and tell the truth. Because you need some place where you don't just get so full up of the panic and upset that this is happening, that when you do have an opportunity, that you will actually cause the person who's talking to you to not know totally what's going on. They just know, I don't want that in my environment. I don't want that feeling that this person is giving off. So I think that's the first thing.
It's great
Thank
to
you.
hear.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was just gonna say it's great to hear that there are ways to find support. I feel like a lot of us as we age, maybe you lose touch with people and your circle might not feel as close and supportive. It's wonderful to hear that you built this circle of people who you weren't necessarily close to all of them, and you found even some opportunities for mentorship. It sounds like within it. I want to bring up our poll again. It's about mentorship today. We want to know from you in the audience, what do you think the key is to a great mentor? Is it subject matter expertise, trust, empathy, listening, something else? Let us know. We're in a conversation right now with Elizabeth White. She is an expert on the boomer workforce. We're talking about how that population is being impacted doubly so by COVID right now. And I have some thoughts coming from the stream, Elizabeth, about work from home opportunities. Clifford wants to know what the best way to find a remote job is. I'd love to hear your answer on that, as well as if you think this is an opportunity for older workers to find jobs remotely that they might not have considered or been considered for if a physical office was still in play.
So I know there is something called side hustle where they actually evaluate different kinds of part-time opportunities and opportunities in the what you either call the sharing or the sharing the crumbs economy. So I think that's one resource. And I'm also noticing I was on Idealist. The job search site a few weeks ago, and there were many more part-time jobs, many more remote jobs, because the truth is a lot of companies are not going to be coming back full-time. Everybody's trying to figure out sort of what the play will be, as we come out of the summer, but there's much more openness around working from home now than there would be under normal circumstances. So I think in that way, we don't even have to look at, part-time uh, jobs. They're going to be jobs that were normally would be full-time are now going to be online, or there'll be much more flexibility than would be typical.
Yeah, we have Laura in the stream saying that she's right here with you, with everyone joining. She's 60 and it feels impossible to get back into the workforce. I'm wondering for someone like Laura who maybe is going to choose to stay out of the workforce, or someone else who can't get back in, that's not their choice. What are the plans? What do you do first? If suddenly your source of income has been cut off, what's the practical first step to really take a sober look at it? And what do you do first to protect
So
yourself?
I think there are a couple of things to do. One, you're looking at what are your assets and what are your skills and what do you like to do. So one thing that I did when this was happening to me, I actually did a list of sort of my last 6, 7 jobs. And on one side, I put what I loved about those jobs. And on the other side, I put what I hated about those jobs. So it started from there on the love side to at least emerge what was important to me. So I'm someone who works quite well by themselves. Other people like to always be in a group. I don't mind doing research. Some people want to be more customer facing. All of that will kind of be clear. I think realistically now, as an older worker, we don't like this. I didn't like it. But I had to also consider jobs that I was overqualified for. Because the goal right now is to survive. The goal right now is to be able to go another round. So that may mean that you are taking jobs that you in the past would have given your assistant, or you're taking jobs that pay a fraction of what you used to make. And this is going to annoy you. You're going to be frustrated. You're going to be interviewing, and you're thinking, I used to run an office bigger than this, or I manage more people than are here. But you want to survive this. And particularly if you are someone, and many of us are, we haven't set aside enough. We need to continue to work. The Social Security we're getting isn't enough. The savings, it's not enough. So we need to cobble together these income streams so that we can, uh, you know, live to go into the future. You have to make some of these decisions. I
Mhm.
say, don't give up though. Don't look at this as forever. I have to take this job that I'm overqualified for. I want you to look at it the way I learned to look at it is not failure, but strategy. You're thinking strategically, in this moment, given all these factors, what do I need to do to survive? So you're going to be considering things that are going to be like, not palatable to you under normal circumstances.
Yeah, it's
I
tough.
call it getting off your throne. I had to get
Mhm,
off my throne. I
mhm.
say, I think when we were speaking, I'm someone, I flew first class, I flew business class, I did all that. When I went to New York earlier this year, I took the bus and I got there. I was there in time for the meeting. So you make those adjustments. And the quicker you can, the better, because you can, the other, there's the income side of this issue, but there's also the expense side of this issue.
Mhm.
And the
Let's
other thing that
for
I
a moment.
was
I do
that,
want to talk about the income
yeah,
inequalities, but before
yeah.
we get off this subject, I'm hearing the word frustration and annoyance and survival, and that feels like a lot to take on in the midst of you are trying to survive. It's a pandemic. You're wondering how you're going to pay your mortgage, your rent. Sheila in the stream wants to ask you, what about the mental health aspects of this? You're giving us some great practical tips, and then what about for up here about staying positive and staying sane and motivated through working on these really tough things, this humility, that bitter pill to swallow if you have to take something what you feel is beneath you.
So for me, in this pandemic right now, so for example, on Mondays, I do a safe walk with two friends. And we have been doing this now for many weeks. A friend drives over. We then walk to the third friend's house. And just to have that time together, both women are sort of in my age cohort. We're both, very interested in current events. We all have children. We talk about the range of things is an anchoring, grounding experience for me. And I look at this in a way, it's different than before. There's so many people impacted. Before, when you look at the sort of 2008, 2009, we already, in the first 3 months of the pandemic, we had more people unemployed than throughout the entire Great Recession. So you're not an outlier here. You're not going to be alone here. There are millions of people, all ages. 40% of the people making under $40,000 are unemployed. So we got big numbers here. So in that sense, there isn't this feeling of, I think, shame that happened when I was going through this in 2009.
Yeah, and we've got Dolores saying, thank you for the advice about getting off your throne. She says, I think that's what I'm struggling with right now, considering jobs I'm overqualified for with poor hours and lower pay. Linda is saying she loves the idea that this is strategic, not failure. She says, thank you for that. Debbie says, this gives me hope. Thank you. Thank you all for joining and sharing these comments and letting us know that this is a helpful conversation. Elizabeth, we were about to start talking about like the assets and the money side of it. So some of the things you can do are, I know, drastically cut your spending, but please carry on with some of the other practical financial tips you have for people in these tough situations.
So I think the mistake I made in 2009 was I waited too long to drastically cut my expenses, because I'm thinking I've got, I went to Harvard and I've worked here and I've done that. I'm going to find a job relatively soon. So my lifestyle sort of stayed the same. Now, what I would say to someone, particularly in this situation where there is so much more uncertainty, is to radically cut your expenses. And so I did eventually get a roommate, but it was, kind of way into it. Now, if that's something that you need to consider, to do that early. Because I think we're in for, when many of us hoped that this was going to be a sprint, I now think it's all dawning on us that this is going to be a marathon.
Yeah, and we have Esther joining us in the stream saying something similar. She's saying it's more of a mental issue. She's worked full time for 50 years, finds herself lost without a schedule and a routine. That's structure, has fallen away. So I know you've built some things in on your own structure. You have the circle, you have the walks that you take. What would you say to someone like Esther, who's used to that routine being there, and that's kind of a rock, a piece of stability that's now gone?
So I mean, I wasn't doing the walks before. I'm sort of a gym person. I was going to the gym. I wasn't, I have a little pod that I operate in of people who to me feel safe because they're not going out that much. So I'm doing things like I made a little casserole yesterday that a friend came over and shared with me. I started my French lessons again that I've been, doing on and off for many years. I am writing again on this topic of, older adults and fragility. So I think, like in this period, we're all figuring out kind of what we can do here, and it really differs from person to person. So I have a dear friend who's really struggling with the alone time. She is very social, and she will sometimes just get in her car and be driving aimlessly because it's hard for her to stay home. So it really depends on your personality. For me, I'm someone, fully appreciating the horrors of what's happening and how it's impacting so many people. But I'm actually someone who liked the lockdown. I mean, I appreciated the pause and the freedom from striving. So, really, I think depends on what your uh, personality is. But I think it's also now to think of how not to waste this moment, how to are there things I've asked a young friend of mine to help me on Instagram. I do nothing on Instagram. So I'm looking at it also as what are some skills that are lacking, gaps in my background that maybe I could take this time to address.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think also, in we're always rushing through everything. It's also, I think, important to we need to grieve the loss of things. I was talking to a mother who was saying her son didn't get to go to the prom.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't get his graduation. Now it looks like his college might not open. There is pain in this and loss that I think sometimes we're not even aware how that is sort of, kind of a downer for our spirit. So there is some like embracing that as well.
Yeah, I think it's important. We have Priscilla saying it's important to talk about positivity and optimism, and I think you're right. It's important to acknowledge that this is a painful, difficult time for people, and that affects every aspect of your life, from work to personal. Irene likes your advice about simplifying your life. I think that's wonderful. Deborah is saying this is the best advice I've heard on this topic. She says, "Thank you, Elizabeth." I have a question from Katie in the stream. I think this is an interesting one. It's about how people define themselves. We're talking using the term older workers, but she wants to know, do people see themselves in a different category until some event like this happens, and then they say, oh, I guess I am an older worker. What is your thought on that, and how people see themselves in this
So
space?
this is a topic among many of my friends. We boomers, so I'm 66 now. So we are the first generation that's going to live as long as we do in reasonably good health. And so there are not many role models. There's not a roadmap for how you do this. And some of the kind of media presentations of successful aging, which is really about how many youthful attributes can you hang on to as you're getting older, is not sort of the model that I think we should be aspiring to. So it's going to be really our generation that figures out for the generations behind us what getting older, having what I call a richly textured life, often on a more modest income than we had anticipated, what does that look like? And because there's no roadmap, we're actually figuring it out.
Yeah, and speaking of generations, these issues aren't just affecting boomers. I'm curious, what do you think about the next generations? You talked earlier about the systemic problems that we're facing that are wrapped up in this. What do you say to the generations that are going to follow the boomers? What should we be looking out for?
So I think this is like a really important point. And I say to people that this is not just a pesky little boomer problem because we don't have pensions, but Gen X is not going to have pensions either. Millennials are definitely not going to have pensions. And you already see with millennials a lot more zigging and zagging. No one in that age cohort expects to be any place 30 years. There's much more awareness of, does this particular activity or job or course of action fulfill me? So it's a very different set of questions than my generation, where we're thinking long term, everything sort of happened in a particular order. That's not happening now. So in a way, I think younger people looking at what's happening to their parents, because the millennials are our children, are seeing struggles around money, or seeing mom has to continue to work, or seeing there are a lot of millennials who are actually, and Gen Xers who are actually chipping in to help their parents weather this stage of life even before the pandemic. So though that information is informing how they are then organizing their lives.
That's great. Elizabeth, we're seeing so much activity in the stream today. I wanted to share a few more comments with people who are just giving their adulation to you. Jane says, yes, in all caps, thank you. I've loved the lockdown as well. She says, I've used this time to connect with so many people. You are not alone. We also are hearing from some other folks who say that this is an opportunity to revisit dreams that have been put on the back burner. Patty says,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
Patty says, Elizabeth, thank you for your great advice. Thanks to your experience and insight, you're helping so many people. Esther says, thank you. I'm working on refocusing and repurposing myself. Elizabeth, thank you for joining us on the show today. I think your wisdom has been really valuable to the stream. I'm so glad that you could come by Business Unusual and share with our community.
Thank you.
That was Elizabeth White. She is the author of 55 Underemployed and Faking Normal, Your Guide to a Better Life, sharing her insights with not just the boomer generation, but everyone who comes afterwards, saying that there's some systemic problems here that we all have to be aware of. I want to check back in on the results of our LinkedIn News poll right now. We were asking, what is the key to a great mentor? And it looks like a lot of you are saying empathy and listening skills. I think that makes a lot of sense given the conversation we just had with Elizabeth and what great responses you had to that. Some people saying trust and commitment. Priscilla, Aldo, Deborah, I see you there. Becky says subject matter expertise is important to her. And Esther says a mentor that leads by example is what is of most value to her. So Esther, thank you for adding in your thoughts there. This has been Business Unusual. We are here live from the LinkedIn news page every weekday at 12 Eastern. Tomorrow, my colleague Caroline Fairchild will be hosting Citi's Jane Fraser talking about the future of finance. I hope you tune in for that. We look forward to seeing you there, and thank you for joining us today.